It reflects the values and priorities of our civilization. It dictates not only who prospers or who struggles, but also what ideals we choose to promote. When ill-conceived, it can perpetuate inequalities, exacerbate injustices, and even threaten our human rights and human existence. So, Aslema, hello, I'm Emily bin Sikali, and I am very happy to be here today, and I like to welcome you to this podcast towards the global financial architecture at the service of human rights. I also want to say marhaba, welcome to our studios in Tunis and to our guests, Diana Ohini Omar.
Thank you very much. My name is Diana Mochoge. I work for the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, based in Nairobi, Kenya. Pleased to be in Tunis and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Ohini Ampofo-Anti. I'm with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and I'm based in Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you for this opportunity to be on this podcast.
Good evening, everyone. Happy to be with you. I'm Omar Annam, based in Cairo, Egypt. I'm with the Social Justice Platform. Very happy to be in Tunis Al Khadra.
Thank you. Welcome all. So we are today very privileged to hear from voices who are working tirelessly for this transformation, the transformation of the global financial architecture. Together, we will explore how advocacy strategies, mechanisms, and tactics can shape a global financial architecture that truly serves human rights. After all, rethinking this global financial architecture, thinking about this financial system means redefining our future. So I'll start with you, Ohini. I'd like to ask you how human rights are lacking in financial governance today, and how can we influence their integration?
What we're seeing today is that there's a lack of human rights being put at the center of proposals to transform global economic governance and the global financial architecture. This is clearly illustrated by the flaws of the OECD's two-pillar proposal, which is essentially, as UN Special Rapporteurs has found, is reifying colonial era racial hierarchies, which actually reinforce imbalances between the global north and global south, and don't actually enable countries in the global south, especially on the African continent, to actually have the resources they need to actually fund and resource fundamental rights like education, healthcare, etc. And so what we're pushing for as CSR is what we call a rights-based approach or a rights-based economy. So it's kind of moving economics away from a model of extractivism, of overconsumption, of the endless pursuit of economic growth and profit towards an economy which is orientated around people and planet. And this is kind of how human rights can shift. It can shift power imbalances between the global north and global south, and it can also give us a shared language and agenda to rethink the direction of economic policy at the national, regional, and global level.
And how do civil society organizations influence this global financial architecture to integrate human rights? What's the role of civil society organizations?
The role of civil society is key. There's many ways for civil society to participate. Currently, we have negotiations around a UN tax convention, and the ad hoc committee actually has given opportunity for civil society to make submissions. They've recently released a zero draft of the terms of reference, and many signatories in civil society, including my organization and others, trade unions, economic justice, tax justice, and climate justice organizations have made submissions trying to put human rights at the forefront. It's also important to have a mix of insider and outsider tactics. What I mean by that is insider tactics is where we actually try to find progressive state actors and entities that we can actually work with who are more state-led. So for example, the Africa Group has been key in pushing this sort of rights-based agenda, and we at CSR try to make use of progressive formations among states, but outsider tactics also mean building power from below. So working with movements, grassroots movements and organizations to actually shift the narrative around how rights should be at the center of proposals for the transformation of the global financial architecture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ohini. Indeed, these perspectives offer ways of rethinking our economic structures, to a more just and equitable economy, and in an inclusive way. So personally, when I listen to you and talking about African countries, talking about this global financial architecture, it invites me and it invites us all to deconstruct the power dynamics inherited from the colonial past, and to create systems that respect and value like human rights and the human experience and needs. And when speaking about colonial past, we are talking about global south. We are talking about Africa, the African continent, African countries. So hello again, Diana. Diana is working with AFRODAD. She's working on the continental level. What do you think of what our colleague Ohini said?
Okay, thank you very much. And just to pick up from what Ohini has talked about, especially in terms of human rights and the rights-based approach, we see that we cannot separate financing from human rights. And why do I say this? Because financing actually provides resourcing for services. And Ohini has rightly pointed out sectors like education, health, financing, health, and actually education and other sectors like agriculture. They require financing to be able to thrive and to be able to do well in an economy. So we cannot separate the two. We cannot look at financing without looking at the implications on human rights. And so he's rightly put it that it's time for us to have a rights-based approach where we put people at the center in terms of how we budget, and in terms of how those monies are being spent and how those monies are being allocated, to ensure that all the sectors get the right kind of support to be able to have a thriving economy. And this cannot happen when we have unjust systems, which has rightly been pointed out. And it's not just the OECD. We talk about international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF that have very unjust policies and systems that keep African countries at the bottom of the value chain. They don't allow African countries to prosper because of how they have structured their systems to keep African countries trapped in debt and trapped in poverty. So the systems that are there at the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, and these international institutions continue to keep Africa at the bottom, and they continue to keep Africa at a place where we are not able to get out of the debt crisis, which I will talk about later on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you've been talking about prosperity, but there is also the sovereignty. So it's like, how can we respect those two big concepts? How do we can integrate them in this reform of the global financial architecture?
Okay, so in terms of sovereignty, we, as AFRODAD, we are pushing for Africa to be the rule maker and not the rule taker, meaning that we are the ones to provide the solutions and not just to take on the policies that are being pushed down to us. And Ohini already rightly pointed out to OECD the two-pillar rule, which is not a solution. We also have very harsh austerity measures that are pushed down to African countries by the IMF, especially when it comes to taxation. And we're already seeing what is happening to Kenya at the moment because of the very punitive tax measures that have been introduced by the Finance Bill 2024. And this is just an example, but we see how the IMF pushes a lot of austerity measures to African countries with respect to the moment you take a loan from them. So African countries need to be at the forefront in terms of setting their own rules in the sovereignty aspect, to say that we can be able to have our own national policies which are entrenched in our laws that protect Africa from being impoverished by the Western countries, and especially by these international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and even OECD. So having very strong national policies, ensuring that you're protecting your state from losing out in terms of income and in terms of resources, and ensuring that you have very strong policies in terms of taxation, in terms of debt, in terms of ensuring that the economy is growing. Mm-hmm. So building on sectors like manufacturing, building on sectors like agriculture, which is very big for Africa, and even ensuring that we are adding value to the natural resource governance that we have in the region, because we are very rich in resources. So how do we maximize the richness of our resources to ensure that Africa continues to thrive and continues to grow? Yes.
Thank you, Diana. I'd like to turn to you, Omar, since you are mainly working on the North Africa region. Does Diana's speech resonate to you?
Yeah, of course. Like being in the situation of being a rule taker, not a rule maker, is something that we're quite familiar with in the North, as we are, I think, all across the continent. I think in many ways, North Africa, there is like a fictitious division between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. In reality, North Africa is usually just the first to be exposed to new forms. I can say physically we are the closest to the center, so we get exposed to that, to the new radioactive policies first, usually. And then it proves successful, we're the testing ground, and then it gets exported all over. But most of our problems are kind of the same problems that you have all across the continent. Regimes that are, in a lot of cases, not really representative of their people's interests or representative of a small sliver of the population. Sorry. We have a lot of dependence, economic dependence on the former colonial powers. The official forms of imperialism, have been dismantled, but in reality, the economic foundations of it are still ongoing. When we look at the history of Africa and the colonization project in Africa, a lot of it was centered around breaking existing value chains and inserting the colonial power in the middle to ensure that independence becomes a problem. Sadly, since the anti-colonial movement started, we've had varying degrees of success in trying to decouple from that colonial relationship, but we haven't been ultimately successful. And that results in the fact that you look in, for instance, in the trade profiles of North African countries, which are the ones that I'm familiar with, you see that usually the top 2 or 3, sometimes even 7 biggest trade partners are European countries, plus or minus China. So you look at something like the Agadir Agreement, for instance, which includes Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan. The agreement has been in effect for something like 20 years, and you look at the trade volume between these countries, almost minimal, nothing compared to Egypt's trade. I'm not even going to say the big trading partners for us, like Italy or China. Minimal even compared to small European countries. I think our trade with Belgium is bigger. So all of that, like being, retaining that kind of dependent relationship, it seriously reduces your sovereignty and your ability to make the rules, because while we can't band together North African countries, because while we like the economic makeup is set up for us to be actually closer to Italy than we are to Tunis or Morocco or Libya. I think that's probably like, that's a pattern that holds over most of the continent. And yeah, I would say that that's probably one of the biggest problems that we face when we try to move on continental issues. And that was the biggest wedge that could be used against us during the anti-colonial movement, where colonial powers could use that to divide and conquer. And ultimately, if we want to achieve our political sovereignty, we need to build the economic infrastructure for it first.
And how about cooperation? There is a talk often about the lack of dialogue and coordination between North African countries. Like, there is an absence, a total absence of the North African countries in like the Korean discussion about the reforming of the global financial architecture.
The problem for a lot of African countries, and North African countries again in particular, is that we're at very dangerous debt levels and under a lot of stress, especially in our current account balances. And that puts you in a place where it's very easy to exert pressure on you, because losing access to something that's very new, like access to sovereign capital markets or sovereign debt markets, which a lot of our countries didn't have access to up until like maybe a decade ago. Now, if you lose access to it, it can completely destroy your economy within like a year, because you've become dependent on it. And being in that situation, while you're a kind of, you end up in a very weird situation. I don't know if I can say this or not, but you end up in the situation where you're expecting your drug dealer to take you to rehab. Like these are the people, these are the institutions that help put you in this place where you are destitute, poor, and in a very tough spot. And now, well, they can use that to put some pressure on you if you ever try to get out of line. The truth is, breaking from any system is not going to be without pain. Breaking from colonialism, it was very painful for a lot of our countries. A lot of us got invaded in the process. A lot of us had concentration camps set up in our countries. That wasn't painless. But if there is a political will and the ability to mobilize the people and galvanize them to what they need, I think that would be very easy. I think our people across the continent are yearning for change. We're seeing it as we speak right now. If that will is not there, yeah, sure, things will stay the same. But I think we're all over the continent, we're really waiting for a spark. We're waiting for someone to capitalize on it.
So I would like now to turn to all of you to ask you about obstacles. So coming from different backgrounds, but working on the same issue, what are the obstacles you are facing when working about the reform of the global financial architecture?
I wouldn't mind starting. So I think one thing which is a problem is that we have silos. And we need to bridge silos, because we have organizations who are working on debt justice, organizations working on tax justice, organizations working on climate justice, human rights, feminist approaches, etc. And we need to kind of have a groundswell of movements who are working on how we tie these different elements together to address what we like to call the polycrisis. So what we need is a rights-based, feminist, decolonial, green, alternative to the dominant economic model. And then in terms of the actual reforms to the international financial architecture, a serious obstacle that we're facing is OECD countries trying to act as a bloc to actually undermine the progress from the Africa Group and G77, and specifically by trying to argue that this UN process is duplicating things, or that this is only about capacity building, or even attempts to say that we need consensus voting, which is a way to kind of dilute the power of Africa and the G77 to be able to vote and pass resolutions. So those are kind of the sort of geopolitical blockings that we're seeing. But I think in civil society, the major challenge that we're seeing is the need to break down silos, and we need a lot more cross-movement, solidarity, and a groundswell to actually challenge the dominance, the hegemony of the neoliberal economic model.
I think if I may, like, take that point, like, yeah, I think the silos are a problem, and a big part of that is academization of civil society. And like, while yeah, academia is important, it helps us build our cases and everything, but you can't build that groundswell by like going to like regular people and like, yeah, going into super technical details. Nobody is going to be interested in, like, none of my friends are interested in advocating for like against Pillar 2 of OECD tax convention. Nobody cares about that. That's not an issue that you can get passionate about or go to the streets for. I think that we end up, like, it's important to go into academia to like justify our demands, but I think that a problem in civil society movements is that part where, yeah, where we kind of get lost in the sauce of academia and forget that, no, actually what we're advocating for is like very basic, like human dignity demands. It's, we're not protesting against like this pillar of the tax convention. We're protesting because you want to have like good education for your kids, good healthcare, good schools, good housing. That's what we're actually working for. And yeah, that's, I think that's the like siloization of civil.
2016 نذكر وقتها ثم شاب في القصرين وقتها حرق روحه وصارت معناتها كاينه اكسبلوزيون معناتها بتاع حركات معناتها احتجاجيه من القصرين وقتها نحن نتبعوا فيها في ليديسي وقتها معناتها في ظرف جمعه الاحتجاجات مست قرابه 14 ولايه معناتها في جمعه احتجاجات نتاع معطلين نتاع ناس معناتها خرجت للشارع وكل شيء لامباكت ديريكتومون معناتها نتاع التصحيح نتاع الواحد الدولة معناتها elle s'était retirée قالت معناتها لا مش نوظف حتى واحد مش وقفت معناتها المفاوضات الاجتماعية ووقفت الدنيا الكل صار معناتها هذاك اللي تنسال نتاع السيد معناتها طلع للبوتو هكا وقت ضربوا الضوء وكذا وبدت معناتها الاحتجاجات نفس الشيء صار في 2018 وقت اللي رجعنا معناتها باش نعاودوا نناقشوا معناتها على القرض اللي بعده 2018 وقتها صار معناتها على القانون نتاع الميزانية احتجاجات معناتها منع التضامن كذا كذا كذا
I like what he said. It's about bringing people into what you're pushing for. Most of the time we get into this space where we are talking to ourselves. And a lot of time when you're having conversations with the government, especially members of parliament, even ministers of finance, they usually say it's like you're talking to yourself. How do you bring these other stakeholders in? And it's not just the government, but also citizens, because at the end of the day, these policies are affecting the people. How do we get the people to be involved, to be engaged, to be interested in the UN Tax Convention, in issues of debt, in issues of trade, investment? It's by breaking it down to a level where they understand and they can be able to engage. But also, I would say civil society organizations in Africa at the moment are facing a challenge of shrinking civic space. You've talked about Northern Africa, where the moment you speak up against against issues of finance, you're challenging the government on accountability and transparency, the next thing they will do is to deregister your organization. They will politicize the issue and say you're a terrorist group or something of the sort, and your operations shut down. And we've seen that even in Eastern Africa. With Uganda right now, civil society organizations are being deregistered almost daily. Zimbabwe also faced that last year. Eswatini also, there was a lot of human rights violations within activists and human rights also activists when they show up to speak about issues that affect the people. So you also have this agenda where civil society organizations are being deregistered and almost being silenced for the work that they are doing. So it's also an obstacle because you cannot be able to speak about these issues and to further the advancement of human rights.
So how are you overcoming these challenges?
So if I would piggyback off your point, just like they learn from each other, as you mentioned, like Uganda, Eswatini, Northern Africa, they seem to be learning these like methods of oppression from each other. We also need to learn the methods of resistance from each other. Like every time I'm in a Pan-African space, I meet a lot of people who have experiences that I definitely can't replicate in Egypt because like it's a different social and economic context. But I also meet a lot of like methods of like coping and like overcoming these hardships that end up being very effective. And they're very effective because they're new to my context and nobody's ready for that. I think the same thing, it's kind of an eternal race. Just as methods of oppression advance and find new ways, methods of resistance also have to do that.
I think for us, something which is very important is focusing on our partnership models. So because we are in an interesting position where we're in between being a real sort of global north and global south organization, we have to be a bit more wary of our positionality. And what's very important to us is kind of our partnership model and how we kind of try to break down hierarchies and try to shift power in terms of how we actually work with different types of organizations at a domestic and regional level. But the other thing which is important for us is trying to use our specific positionality as a convener role and trying to convene on sort of alternative economic models. So you know that there's a lot of talk now around things like degrowth, social and solidarity economies, care economies, buen vivir in Latin America, decolonized economies. And so we're trying to help bring actors together from these different spaces to have conversations about alternative approaches to the dominant model. So I think solidarity and how your organization can partner with other organizations and being wary of where it's placed. So is it a regional network? Is it a more professionalized think tank? Is it a sort of grassroots movement? And trying to be wary of how you have power and trying to disrupt power and build synergies, because we're not all in the same position in terms of how we can use levers of change.
And how about the feminist perspective and intersectional approach? How can we bring it to the table in like when discussing the global financial architecture reform?
I think maybe a few key points with intersectionality and a feminist approach is one, not having gender blind or color blind approaches. We need to have race conscious and gender conscious approaches which actually take into account structures of subordination rooted in colonialism, slavery, apartheid, and patriarchy. And we actually need to pay attention to how contemporary macroeconomic policies, whether they're prescriptions from the IMF and World Bank or being pushed by the G20, we need to look at the way these reproduce these systems and structures of inequality. And another pillar of an intersectional approach is what we call a bottom-up approach. So trying to put those who are marginalized at the forefront and at the center of how policies are redesigned, because those who are actually at the front lines actually have solutions already, but often they are not included And a good example is how in the current UNTC process, while it's been better at participation than the OECD process, it's been a bit weak on participation of civil society actors, feminist groups, and broadening participation to the groundswell of groups and marginalized communities. And if they could be at the center of shaping economic policy, that would shift power, and that's really what feminist and intersectional approaches are about.
So before closing, I want to ask, briefly, what's the 3 priorities when reforming the global financial architecture? 3 top priorities. Yeah.
I think, I think probably like Diana would have the better points because after that they do have the leadership on that part.
Yeah, it's actually putting the voices or the voice of Africa to be at the center. And we've just been talking about Africa for the longest time has been on the menu but not on the table. So it's ensuring that Africa is center, the voice of Africa is heard, the voice of Africa is represented in terms of decision making. For so long, and we've said in this podcast that rules have been made for Africa, but now we are saying that Africa needs to make the rules. And so we are working to ensure that the voice of Africa is not left out in decision making. And how are we doing that is by ensuring that we are strengthening the role of the African Union. Because the African Union, as you know, right now has become a member of the G20. And so it's going to be a very key process for Africa in terms of setting the agenda by being in the G20, because you know G20 is led by the richer and more developed countries. So AU being at the seat of the G20 will be able to determine how Africa can be able to actually have better policies in place to ensure that our economies are thriving, to ensure that we maximize on our natural resource wealth, and to also ensure that we have proper systems in place that actually work for the benefit of Africans.
I think for us, if there's time, some of our priorities would be, 1, mobilizing towards this United Nations Tax Convention, and it needs to be comprehensive and has a rights-based, decolonial, green, feminist approach to international taxation. I think when talking about climate is climate finance and using a reparations-based approach. So the idea that former colonial powers owe an ecological debt to small island developing states and countries in the global south and Africa. And thirdly, reforms to the international debt architecture as well. We need serious reforms to debt, because debt is part of what's draining African countries from having resources. So linking debt, tax, and climate in a rights-based approach is what I think for us and our allies and the work we're doing is kind of what is key right now.
I think I'll start from your last point about that, because I think, I think we need to be more forceful about renegotiating our debts. I think we need to collectively move. Right now, I think 60% of the countries in Africa are going through a debt crisis. I think we need to seriously move into invoking the odious debt doctrine. I think we seriously need to start threatening stuff that I know might be controversial, like selective sovereign default on specific debts. Like even invoking solidarity in that, like these like specific types of debt that we know were particularly odious. No one on the continent is going to pay those again. Which I know that is pretty much like a war declaration for a lot of people, but I think we need to be able to have a stick next to the carrot, or otherwise we're just going to get like breadcrumbs as every time. Other than that, I think we also need to start putting serious effort into like actualizing African integration. In terms of trade, in terms of economic cooperation, in terms of people's movement, That's still very underdeveloped. And the last thing, I think we need to repoliticize economics, because for a while now, perhaps for most of our lives, economics has been a technocratic thing where it's presented as if it's just the objective economic policy is presented as if it's the objective scientific truth, and not the political decisions of people who are seeking their own personal interests. I think on local, national, regional level, we need to repoliticize economics and portray it as what it is, a tool of power, a tool of distributing resources.
Thank you all. I think that this debate is essential and very urgent because it's about our common future. We hope that this discussion has given rise to our listeners. Thank you guys, thank you Omar, thank you Hini, thank you Diana for joining us today. Indeed, this discussion is very essential and urgent because it concerns our common future. So I want to thank all our listeners. Stay informed and stay tuned for our next episode.